All right, good morning. Welcome to this webinar with the Shared Use Mobility Center. I'm Benjamin de la Peña, and welcome. We've got about 200 plus attendees with so far in the room. So welcome. And let me take this time, first of all, to thank you and welcome you. It's good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. This is your 500 millionth Zoom meeting for the COVID year or the extended COVID year. So, but hopefully you will find this one filling and thought-provoking and at least a very interesting conversation to set us off for this start of this new year and new possibilities. Again, I'm Benjamin de la Peña or Benjie de la Peña. People call me Benjie. And I'll be your moderator for today. I am the new CEO at the Shared Use Mobility Center. The Shared Use Mobility Center is a public interest nonprofit dedicated to creating a multimodal transportation system that works for all. Let me introduce very, very briefly, and I will ask them to introduce themselves in a moment, and I'll ask them to turn on their cameras so that you can at least see them. Our panelists for today, we have Ashwini Chhabra, the Chief Public Policy Officer at TIER, and he's also the co-founder and principal of Electric Avenue and has a very long bio apart from that with experience in government and in the private sector in transportation. Alissa Walker is the urbanism editor of Curbed and has been writing about cities and transportation for over a decade now. Stefanie Brodie is the research practice lead at Toole Design, working on long-range planning and data. And she was also at the DC DOT previously. Adonia Lugo, who is the interim chair of the MA in Urban Sustainability in Antioch University in Los Angeles, was supposed to join us but could not join us today. She's expecting her first child, so we're excited about that. But we're sorry not to have her. Instead, I'll be reading a segment of her book to take the place of hearing her voice in our panel. We really would love to have her today, so we will do our best to try to channel some of the ideas and thoughts that she has championed so well over the last decade or so. So let me start by asking briefly each of our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us what is it that you're working on right now. And let's do that alphabetically. So I'll start with Alissa.
Hi, good morning. If there's construction and landscaping going on outside my door, so if you hear anything, it's just a loud droning noise. It's probably one of those pieces of machinery. So happy to have you. Benjie and I are old friends. I'm so happy to have this conversation and hear more about the great work that my fellow panelists are doing. Benjie's correct. I've been writing about these things for a long time. Curb recently became part of New York Magazine, so it's really exciting to have a larger platform of maybe non-transportation people to share these ideas with and hopefully get more of them on board with us, a lot of these ideas. Currently, a lot of what I'm doing is kind of looking at the new administration, our new Secretary of Transportation, and what he wants to do and what the possibilities are as far as advocates really getting their voices heard and getting some policy into place that can make big changes for climate equity, helping parents save money as they get their kids around town. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Welcome, Alissa. Ashwini?
Thanks, Benjie. Really excited to be here. Couple of words about me. My background is after an uninspiring start as an M&A lawyer, I went to work in government at the Bloomberg administration, focusing on education, transportation, and then found myself working in the for-hire segment when a company called Uber came to town. And so from there on, I've been very interested in and focused on the shared mobility space. And so really great to be part of the conversation here at SumC and love what you all as an organization have been leading. The latest on my end, I worked at Uber for a while. I worked at Bird when micromobility got started. And then with some colleagues from Bird, founded Electric Avenue last year, which is a sort of a policy research and strategy firm working in the mobility space. And I'm currently in week 1 of my new and latest role as the head of policy at TIER, which is a European micromobility company, and learning very much the cultural differences and approaches to policy and how companies work with cities. So really timely conversation. I think the ability to sort of contrast what's the US company and US city approach versus what I'm seeing in Europe has been pretty eye-opening for me. So really looking forward to having that conversation with you all.
Welcome, Ashwini, and congratulations on the new assignment.
Thank you.
Stefanie.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Stefanie Brody. I'm the research practice lead at Toole Design, and I've had a bit of a journey from academia to the public sector to consulting where I am now. And I started at Georgia Tech as a grad student and spent time there working on a PhD in equity analysis and understanding how we can incorporate equity into long-range planning. From there, I moved to DDOT in DC, which is the District Department of Transportation. And there I was coordinating research as well as working on the micromobility pilot program. So the scooters and the dockless bike share when that first came out. And once I left DDOT, I came over to Toole Design Group. And so I've been working on coordinating research and producing research products. A lot at the national level, but also for cities and regional governments. And a lot of my focus has been on equity analysis and supporting equity analysis with our clients, as well as general safety, pedestrian and bicyclist safety, and supporting research in that way.
Welcome, Stefanie. And as you can see, to the audience, we have really, really great, important voices and leading thinkers in the panel. Let me frame our conversation a bit of what it is I want to talk to them about and have a conversation about. So I'd also like to acknowledge my two colleagues, Leslie Gray, our communications director, and Israel Ramirez of our communications team, who have put this panel together and are managing the back end, and also Hannah Wilson, who is also on our team. We will try to make space for questions and answers. If you do have a question, use the Q&A link on your Zoom. But I'll warn you ahead that what we want to do is have a conversation with our three panelists. And if we have time in the end, then we'll make space for questions. We will try to answer your questions offline or maybe publish them in some way. But the primary slice of our time is having these conversations with these three amazing people. So just a bit of a backstory. After my, finishing my master's and having a new urban planning degree about a decade and a half ago, I went to work for Smart Growth America, the Smart Growth Leadership Institute. And Harriet Tregoning, who now leads NUMO, was my boss. She had just come off being working for the state of Maryland. And Don Chen, who now leads CERDNA Foundation, was leading Smart Growth America. I'm putting this in context because that was also a moment of change around that time, the middle and towards the end of the last decade. Back then, we couldn't call it sustainable urban development. We called it smart growth, because if you called anything sustainable, you were immediately a tree hugger. And so a lot has changed since then. Very shortly, I moved on to Rockefeller Foundation. Rockefeller funded the creation of T4 America, really to push for change in the federal transportation policy. And we all thought that was a moment. This was 2008. President Obama was coming on, new Democratic president. The transportation bill was going to get reauthorized. And there was this major economic cataclysm right in the 2008 and 2009. So this was the moment. And so we mobilized to try to change federal transportation policy. We did have some wins, but we didn't get to change the fundamental funding formula of federal transportation. 80 cents of every transport dollar still goes to highway building, and 20 cents still go to, or less than actually, 18 cents goes to funding transportation projects. So I look back a decade and a half later, and other things, though, have changed, and significantly so. Yes, we still have a system that privileges and prioritizes private car use. We still spend billions of dollars expanding highways or building new highways, while our rail and bus systems starve. But complete streets became a creature of local policy. And then apart from that, the technology, bike shares, micro-mobility, cities became cool. Millennials decided that they didn't need driver's licenses. And technology disrupted transportation, right? So how did that all happen? So right now we're in another moment of change and hopefully a moment of hope. And we could spend our time in this hour talking about the changes happening at the administration and the possibilities. Everyone who is in transportation seems to be. There's lots of discussion going on. But we call this the moment of transportation inflection reflection, because there's been lots of inflection and we want to think about what are the deep things that are actually happening. So we've had we still haven't emerged from COVID. Transit agencies are in crisis. Climate crisis is now very, very real, right? Just the effects of this weekend and what's still happening in Texas, right? And all the other states. So I want to look though at the deep, slow changes, the sudden, powerful changes that we are not aware of, in the way that in 2008, we thought we could change federal transportation policy significantly. We didn't get to do it significantly, and yet there were massive changes that happened that we didn't foresee. Stuart Brand, who wrote Clock of the Long Now and How Buildings Learn, made popular Frank Duffy's idea of shearing layers, how in systems, some parts of layers move faster and change faster than other parts. And he came up with the pacing layers. So fashion is very fast. Commerce is a little slower, but fast. Infrastructure, governance, culture, and nature are very slow. But they're very powerful things in the system. And this is how he puts it. He says, fast learns, slow remembers. Fast proposes, slow disposes. Fast is discontinuous, slow is continuous. Fast and small instructs, slow and big. And fast and small instructs, slow and big by accrued innovation and by occasional revolution. Slow and big controls, fast and small and fast by constraint and constancy. Fast gets all our attention, slow has the power. So what I want to talk about are the fast and the slow things, the deep and slow things. Let me, before I dive in with my panelists, read from Adonia's book, just so that we have her voice, and it gives us also some more context. And I'm reading from her book, Bicycle Race, Transportation, Culture, and Resistance. Human infrastructure is the term I use to describe how social networks make particular actions seem possible or impossible. The concept formed at the intersection of my activist engagement and scholarly research. I found some great work on creative urban survival by ethnographers Abduk Malik Simone and Philip de Beck. They both wrote about how in Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, they saw people take over the work of infrastructure. When physical systems fell apart or went offline, underlying social network kept goods and services flowing. This reminded me of the survival cycling I saw in LA. I also knew that riding bikes was easier if you knew other people who rode bikes. So she continues on, but I'm going to jump so that we forget funding bike lanes. What we need were bike crews at every high school, co-ops at every community center, stipends for the old guys who repaired bikes for kids in the neighborhoods. We needed to pay poor people for using bicycles and being part of the growing network through which more sustainable transportation cultures could flow. What more direct action could there be to disrupt the usual devaluation of people who use bikes to survive? And basically, she's talking about how culture was much more powerful than physical infrastructure for the people leading the changes in the bike and bike systems and transportation that we have. So with that, I'll jump. I've been going on quite a bit already. I'm going to jump into our conversation and ask the first question, right? Softball question for all of our panelists. Given the context I just said, how are you feeling about this moment in time? Shared use, mobility, and transportation. And I'll let anyone take on that question.
I'll just start from one part that I thought that was so striking is like the fast ideas get all the attention, and we really have to keep helping to remind people about the slower ideas or the slow movements, because I feel like, especially at this moment, what makes every headline about transportation, as someone who reports on these and people ask me about them all the time, what's the biggest thing? Anything that Elon Musk says becomes like the top transportation headline for like a week in the news cycle. And I have to spend all my time being like, no, we can't dig a bunch of tunnels under Miami. No, we really can't like just make a hyperloop that goes from one place to another, and it's just like a constant pushing back on these easy, fast solutions that are supposed to solve every problem, but are just being dreamed up by someone who hasn't really cooperated very well with city governments and really doesn't have anybody's interest at stake beyond, his well, no offense to anyone who owns a Tesla, but the people who believe that their cars are self-driving vehicles right now, and they are not.
Teslas in tunnels don't appeal to you, I guess. But that would be very
fast. Tunnels, as long as they have trains in them.
I'll hop in. I think kind of on the slow end of things. I am a bit anxious about transit. So, transit is the backbone of shared mobility, and the pandemic has really hit it hard. So I'm hopeful there is, an opportunity for bike share and car share to kind of step up and increase their use while we're still hesitant about transit. But it's kind of a general weird time where we travel is in flux, and it's likely that we'll have less commute trips in the future regardless, but after we return pre-pandemic, will we still have kind of our shrunken travel sheds around our homes, or will it go back to pre-pandemic travel patterns? And I'm not sure. But I think this is a chance that we can rethink how we're traveling and how we plan our transportation systems.
Right. So the travel patterns are a big thing that's shifting, right? And we're not seeing where that's hit. Ashwini, what are you optimistic?
I'm by nature a hopeful person and an optimist, and so I'm optimistic in this time. And I think about this notion of the crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and so that's where I'm kind of reserving some judgment. Are we actually going to take full advantage of the crisis moment that we're in? Right? There's components to that. Is like, are resources going to become available? That's often something that happens in crisis time. We haven't seen it yet. We're hopefully in the beginning of seeing Secretary Mayor Pete bring a very urban perspective to the purse strings and some of the top level decision making. And so maybe resources will come, will be forthcoming. The priorities become clearer. Regulations and sort of hard rules that for decades have been thought of as sacrosanct kind of go out the window. Like the fact that you can now basically open a restaurant in the middle of the street when that was just unheard of prior to this gives me hope. And really, to echo what Stefanie was saying, waiting to see how much of that stays and how much of that we kind of decide when things are back to normal that, hey, this is an aberration and let's go back to what we had before. I don't see it. I'm hearing so many more voices expressing an interest in a change that I never heard before. And if you're like us in that echo chamber on sort of urbanist and smart mobility and sustainable mobility Twitter, you're seeing many more people taking up the cause, and so that's encouraging to me. And it's something that leadership is more aware of. The mayors in our cities are hearing from more people and from more corners that the status quo just is intolerable. And so this notion of what are our streets for, and they're for people as opposed to for car storage or car use, like I think that notion is getting more currency. And so elected officials are responsive to what they hear from their constituents. And so I think there's an opportunity here for louder and more voices to change some of the conversation.
So I'll pick up on that and open it up to Stefanie and Alissa too, but I will pursue something. I'm really fascinated that you have a title called Chief Public Policy Officer, which I think is new. You might be the first one for transportation. But is that one of the big shifts that needs to happen for shared use and public transportation? The way we think about the street, right? And the way we allocate the street. And if not that, what are the other big, deep shifts that need to happen in the system, in the way we think about things? I know that's a huge question to ask, but I'll open with that one, or follow up with that one. For us to get away from the current systems that are leading us to the, that's just amplifying the climate crisis and exacerbating inequality. What are some of, one or two you think are big shifts that need to happen apart from federal transportation policy or leadership?
To me, really, it's a question of who is made to feel welcome in our cities and on our streets, right? I mean, we've seen this in so many, touch on so many things over the last year, whether it's civil protest against sort of the government role in our lives over the last summer, whether it's the result of COVID, but this notion of how comfortable do I feel just in my own skin walking down the street in my city, that's become a question that's come to the fore. And so who's made to feel welcome? And if you just think about your own local example, how comfortable are you? How comfortable are you with your kids walking down the street or letting them play in the streets? Like that as a foundational question, I think points up a lot of these, what flows from that. As someone who grew up in the suburbs in the 80s, I played in the street. My parents, for hours on end, did not know where I was, and there was a sense of comfort around that. And I don't have that today with my daughter living where I live, and that I think is something that was the result of a century of dominance of the private car that literally changed the landscape of our cities, made the center of the street wider, narrowed the sidewalks where most people can work, live, play. We got less and less space for that because we made room for the automobile and sort of the commercial benefits that brought. No one is saying that there wasn't a public benefit from commerce. There definitely is, but I think we lost sight of the public benefit that comes from recreation and all these other uses of the public space. And so I think we're due for, you asked about the big shift. I think we're due for a pendulum swing back the other way, where we kind of undo some of that incremental seeding of public space to where we feel comfortable playing in the street, walking in the street. And I think COVID just brought that into sharp relief. The fact that we were told to maintain 6 feet of distance, but at least here in New York, sidewalks aren't 6 feet wide. And so that means you're walking in the street, and then cars are moving faster because there's no traffic. And like the sort of downward spiral that we saw coming out of that, I think has shown a spotlight on some of the deficiencies of public policy. And so I think that's definitely something that's an overdue reckoning. Like there's that Robert Frost line, something there is that doesn't love a wall. Like to me, something there is that doesn't love a truck, right? We've kind of gotten to a point where we've got massive vehicles using our streets in the service of, I want my package sooner, or I want my food delivery sooner. And I get it. I want my package sooner too. But I think there's a way to do that that's more sustainable, that's smaller in form. Companies are waking up to this, cities are waking up to this. And so rethinking, all right, we have to have the commercial element. That's the engine that keeps cities moving. But how do you do that on a smaller, more human scale than we have been for the last century?
So the movement of the focus of scales, right? I like that Robert Frost reference. Maybe there's something I wish there was a line, that something else that there is that doesn't like an 11-foot lane.
Yeah.
Right. Stefanie
or an SUV that's taller than you are.
Stefanie and Alissa, what do you think? What are some of the very big shifts that you might be sensing or need to happen, right, or has happened that is not covered in the fast, right, or in the news, or is not from Elon Musk? We've already given him too much airtime in this conversation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Ashwini. And this might be more in the fast lane. and it might be a little bit in actually Ashwini's lane, but I think a big shift that we also need to think about is the role of private companies in shared mobility. And this is even like before TNCs, car shares are private enterprises, and there was some involvement of private companies in bike share. And but I think now there's a shift towards companies being more influential for shared mobility. And in some ways, the data from private companies could become an integral part of our planning processes or how we manage our transportation systems. But where I think the shift really comes into play is the ability of private companies to create mobility ecosystems and kind of influence mobility as a service or mobility on demand. So companies like Uber and Lyft are investing in micromobility and really kind of expanding their platforms to incorporate micromobility as well as car share and even transit. And they're essentially positioning themselves as a portal for an individual's mobility. And that's really convenient for the individual, but it also means that there's an ability to influence the choices that the individual sees and even the decisions that they make primarily through pricing. And it's unclear how it will play out. It might not be such a big factor in the coming years, but I think it is a shift that we need to pay attention to in how private companies in mobility as a service and as a one-stop mobility shop, their impact on our decision making as individual travelers.
Mm-hmm. Alissa?
Yeah, that's been something that I hear about a lot too, is, how much have we given over to private companies that we should have more control over? I'm going to drop a story by Chrissy Dittmore, a friend of mine, who's really written and speaks very eloquently about what mobility as service can be, like what it can represent in our cities, rather than just exactly that, handing it over to a private company to take our data and not having a lot of control over it. And really centering the people who use these systems and use these transportation systems the most. I will say here in LA, we've kept our bike share and our car share, our new EV car share, are run by DOT. They are part of our transportation system. They are integrated with Metro. You can use your tap card to check out a bike. I think soon you could do the same for the car share too, but it's all very integrated and run and managed by our public transit agencies, which I think is kind of key. But for a lot of cities, it's too late. They've already handed over so much to the private companies that you'd have to kind of rebuild it from scratch. I think the other kind of fast shift that I do see, it's fast, but it's been building for decades now, is the reallocation of policing dollars. We're having so many conversations right now about taking police off of our transit system. San Francisco has done an amazing project where they are going to add more social workers instead of having officers on buses. Denver just went through a 6-month pilot where they sent social workers to non-emergency and a lot of situations dealing with people who were unhoused or domestic disputes, and they never arrested anyone or had to call any police for backup. So just to show, after 6 months, these kind of programs really do work if we want to make sure that people feel welcome on our streets, just like you said, and getting around, especially for something like traffic enforcement. I think Berkeley is taking police out of traffic enforcement, even around things like schools. You brought up walking to school. We've got we have a situation here in our schools where they're finally taking the police out of schools, but then every day you're getting to school, you walk up to school, and there's police officers and LADOT people directing traffic just around the schools when the money it hasn't been devoted just to make the spaces safe, make the streets safe just for that walk to school. So you kind of look at where our priorities have been, and it's to put people to police the streets when we should have been making investments in our schools and our communities in a way that makes everybody feel like they can use the streets in a way that feels welcoming.
So to react to that and then throw back a question at you, it's interesting to me that that term mobility as a service itself comes from software as a service, right? But for people who depend on public transportation, mobility is a service. It's very bad service, mostly. So maybe we should start talking about mobility as better service. But that, also kind of shows the bias of the system, right? That, we can turn it into a service, but for a whole lot of people, it really is a service. And then second, just following up, Alissa, to your question, is there something about power or the visibility of power relationships that is changing in the system? Where, I remember in smart growth a decade and a half ago, we didn't really talk about power relationships. We talk about how the policy was shaping certain things, but like no opinion on policing, and didn't realize its implications on race, right, and equity. Is there kind of a recognition now of, there's a power relationship inherent in all of these systems, and maybe making it visible is important? And just throwing that back to you, Alissa, and also asking Stefanie, in the way we gather information, right, there's a power relationship there too. Is that becoming visible also there, or is it making any significant impact on the way we decide things? And Ashwini, later on public policy too, the way we engage in public policy.
Well, I would actually want to have Stefanie answer this, because I think Toole did this amazing recentering of how we do engineering on streets, this focus on empathy. I don't know if you want to talk about that, because I think that's been when we reported on that a few years ago, that was, I think, the most dramatic shift I've seen, going beyond something like level of service to really evaluating who's using streets and why.
Yeah, one of the big campaigns that we hope that really influences the industry is not necessarily a change from our typical 4 E's of engineering, enforcement, education, et cetera, but prioritizing equity, empathy, and ethics. So kind of changing how we're thinking about our transportation system, and really prioritizing people and centering them in the work that we do. So thinking about how our work impacts the outcomes that folks see in the transportation system, and doing so with those 3 new E's: ethics, empathy, and equity. And then I know you also asked about data and kind of how that plays into all this. And I think there's kind of, as we have a shared mobility future that's enabled by data and also like mobile technology, it is changing the system. And I think it's allowed micromobility, as an example, to move forward and expand its user base, and then also expanding new options. But it's brought questions about data, mobility data into light. So questions about privacy, questions about who this data is representing. If we're using this data in our planning or in our management systems, who is represented in this data? And I don't think that the data availability itself is a problem, because data provides information and it helps us to make decisions. But whenever we have a data set, we really need to think about how we're using the data and why we're using it, what the limitations are, and there's going to be some bias. So what that eventual bias might be in terms of our results. So for example, if we're using scooter data to plan bike lanes, first we need to think about who are the scooter trips representing, who is riding these scooters, right. And then where are the companies stationing the scooters and why are they stationing them there? Because there's a bias there in the types of data that we'll see. And then finally, even if this is the right data to use, like our dockless shared scooter trips representative of bike travel. So when it comes to data, there's an inherent bias, but it's not necessarily a negative in and of itself. It's really incumbent upon us to understand what the data reflects, what the biases are, and then more implementing and using that data to be fully aware of the biases and the potential outcomes that we'll see using that data.
That's really fascinating. A decade ago, when all of this smart city verbiage was coming out, I remember I think it was Tim O'Reilly who was saying, the important thing is the data exhaust, or there were headlines on The Economist of data is the new oil. And a decade later, we're thinking, well, yeah, those are existential threats, right? The exhaust and oil, right? And so the availability of the data, I think is really interesting. And yet the underlying questions we didn't used to ask, but we're asking about, who does that data represent? Like cities for a while took Strava data and say, oh, this is where people bike. Yeah, those are the spandex white guys who are racing, and they have Strava on their expensive smartphone. We're going to plan around that. So it's interesting. I think that the question of where is the information coming from and what does it actually present is, I think it's a deep shift that needs to, it's starting to happen, but also needs to happen more. Ashwini, I'll turn to you on in terms of public policy. And I'm not going to recount the whole challenges of micromobility and shared use just showing up in cities, right? And then take us or leave us, and all of that battles. But it's shifted both in terms of how the companies regard engaging with government, but also how companies think about public policy. What are you seeing there? And does it also translate further up the value chain of how the investors are thinking about how you interact with government and public policy and the greater good, right? Community needs.
Yeah. So it's been really interesting. I mean, micromobility has a fairly, or micromobility as we think of it today, e-scooters, e-bikes, has a very short life. I mean, it started in 2018. Micromobility writ large, docked bike share, privately owned bikes obviously goes back much longer. And so I think you've seen some inflection points along the way. The sort of this latest version of it, I think you even see an inflection point even within that 2-year span, and some of it centers on in the U.S. It centers on kind of the awakening of cities to their own power, right? I mean, I think San Francisco is the example that comes to mind as, if you read the early headlines, overrun with scooters, lots of different scooter companies, no real control or even insight or visibility into how many scooters any company had, to the point where both the city and residents were sort of had enough of it, and then the city sort of just hit pause on it and said, okay, we're gonna reassess and take a look at who's a good operator, who asks for forgiveness versus permission, and think about what's right for us as what's the local flavor of micromobility that works for San Francisco, not just something that's transplanted from elsewhere. So I think that's happened in the U.S. So you can sort of say there's the pre-SF version, which really was first mover advantage. You want to get sort of that mind share amongst consumers and be the first app on their phone, because who knows if they will download a second or a third app. There really was a sense of moving fast and breaking things helped you create a business moat, and that's what, you asked what's the investor mindset on it. That was being driven by that. Some of the same money that was backing Uber and Lyft, where this worked, right? Go into a city, makes people fall in love with you, and then just become the thing that elected officials can't get rid of, worked. And that was the playbook. It doesn't work if you are reliant on the public right of way for your business to work. If you are parking your vehicles on the street and they're frankly light and portable and can be impounded if you're sort of not playing by the rules. And so the most interesting thing to me about early days of micromobility, again, in the US, was that these companies didn't know that going in. The thought that we'll show up, we'll put vehicles on the road, and people will fall in love with us, and then cities will have to deal with us, is so naive in retrospect. But that didn't last long. And the thing that's interesting to me is the flip side of this is what we saw in Europe. So in Europe, micromobility sort of came into being, again, e-scooters, e-bikes, a few months after it did in the US, but the approach was very different. And what I've learned and am learning is that it really just isn't in the DNA of European companies and European regulators to operate in that way, that sort of confrontational way. So, I was talking to one of my tier colleagues this morning, and he describes the earliest days as, we weren't going to go to a party that we weren't invited to. And that just like blew my mind, because you would never hear that from his counterpart at a US company. And so, from day one, policy, government relations, and the conversations around sustainability, equity, safety, economic impact they were having those. They've obviously gotten more sophisticated with time, but that was part of the design of the business and where you'll operate and how you structure the business and kind of how you think about what kind of company you are. So I think swappable batteries, which have tremendous potential and lead to a more sustainable solution, is something that originated in Europe. We have it in mind that all this innovation happens in Silicon Valley or happens in the US, and then we sort of export it. But that's a great example of an innovation that came out of a place that values sustainability far more than we seem to here. And it's also an environment where you have compact streets, some places non-existent sidewalks, excellent transit. And so you've got two different laboratories that this experiment is operating in, and I'm really curious to see kind of what very different outcomes come out of that. I think what you're seeing,
consensus to fund public transportation, right?
Yeah,
It's another thing, right?
I mean, that's the backbone, regardless of whether you're in the US or in Europe. Micromobility and shared rides and any sort of new mobility model really only works if you've got that backbone and it's a healthy backbone. If transit starts floundering, if transit fails, then really no number of Ubers and no number of e-scooters is going to save the day.
Sorry, no, just related. I was going to pick up from what you said about just showing up to the party. A neighboring city, so I'm in Seattle, the unceded land of the Duwamish, and one of our neighboring cities is Kirkland, and Kirkland banned the scooters and the bike shares at the start of it, and they spent a year planning it, and then by the time they came around, this is 2019, they said, okay, we're going to bid it out, and no one bid because there was this whole shifting. So it's like, it's one thing to be invited to the party, it's also another thing that the people keep changing that you're supposed to be partying with. Right, so in the space of 3 years, we went from Mobike, Offo to Lime, and then Bird, and then and suddenly they're all kind of different already. It's all shifting. So maybe that, and it's a question I'll ask both Alissa and Stefanie, right? How do you then talk about either both in terms of planning, right, and saying, oh, this is how this company behaves and this is the data they provide, or in the terms of engaging, right, that, oh, we're going to be working with this company, when that side of the equation is rapidly shifting too? And is there something that maybe we can learn from Europe or other places about the money conversation, right, and how we fund this?
Yeah, I'll add a comment to this. When it comes to planning in this context, I think it's very important to really lean heavily on goals. Like, what is it that the city or region or state wants to see as an outcome, and really being clear on the goals, and then seeing how whatever the new fast-moving object is, how that plays into those goals, and how it advances them. So less about trying to create a program that allows whatever the new thing is to play in the space, but how do our goals, how does this new thing actually help advance our goals? So really asking the new tech to support the intention of the city or state. And I think that is kind of the first step, maybe the foundation for dealing with things that are constantly changing very quickly, and you don't have necessarily any control over how it changes or who's going to be playing in the space. But you do know what you want to see at the end of the day, and make sure those are clear to whoever decides to show up to the party.
Alissa?
Yeah, I kept thinking about when Ashwini was speaking about the difference between the European models and American cities. And I was thinking particularly about why things like Uber and Lyft haven't taken off in the same way in those cities. And I immediately also thought of delivery services here. We've had this which is, I think, one of the most terrifying outcomes of the pandemic is how quickly we decided that we should give these delivery services, which have now become pretty much all owned by Uber, right? And in California, particularly, they have bought a law that determines how they treat their workers, and they can change the rules at any time. So we have now given over a tremendous amount of power to one company, basically. There's a few of them. There's a few other ones. They all paid millions of dollars to make sure this law got passed during this time. And now you really don't have, you have restaurants at the mercy of these companies, as well as our streets. I've almost been hit by a delivery driver on our street with our kids, who was trying to get in his deliveries. And I don't blame people for needing to go work for these companies at these times too. So we're in this really terrifying predicament. And if you just look at like, well, would we need those if it was legal to put more stores and restaurants on the corners of every street? If people felt comfortable walking to places to pick up their food, would they need to call somebody to bring it to them, at night? So there's so much to be done and undone when it comes to the way that we've set up the way we use our streets, because it's made very, very small little decisions, like going to get food. And there's a place for delivery, of course, like if you can't leave your house, when you have a baby, it's a very nice thing to be able to, and there are great delivery services too that are working better with restaurants and paying workers fairly. And there's some there's the Drivers Collective in New York, which is like a driver-owned rideshare company, which is really great. But we've given so much of this, we give so much of our cities and our streets over to these companies who are not going to be the solution in the long run. It's going to be creating better communities.
So I've got a follow-up question to you, Alissa, related to that, right? So that, we in the new the urbanists and the transportation geeks have known for some time, right? That thing is a good transportation policy is a good land use policy, right? Although that's very, very hard to bridge. But related to that, have you seen any deep changes in the way we talk about transportation, whether it's solutions or problems in the, last few years, or maybe even in this major inflection point that you think is really good, or it's really scary? What you mentioned, the focus on, the hype around Hyperloop, that might be a terrible thing because we're still looking for silver bullets. And at the same time, we now talk about the distribution of the street and who gets a right to use the street. And I'm glad you weren't run over by a robot, because those are going to, the delivery robots are coming faster than the.
Well, at least they'll fix the sidewalks if the delivery robots come, because they can't go on bad sidewalks. So
they have to put little guiding beacons on the sidewalk itself and maybe pay for it. But is it changing the way we talk about transportation? Are you seeing that?
I think one thing that everybody seemed to understand maybe this year was the importance of, and this is just like in the simplest term, of just public transit to how our cities run. I mean, I think people really started to understand as the agencies started to scale back their service and really limiting, how many people could even be on a vehicle. You really started to see a lot of people standing up for transit riders, transit workers, and really trying to say, like, if this doesn't happen, if we don't keep transit going, we're close to like societal collapse. I mean, I think it took a long time for people to understand that even if they didn't ride the bus mattered. And finally, you're seeing not only cities step up and fund their systems in a way that they should be doing it, but also the advocacy voice really shift in a way that's not just like, let's make sure essential workers, can get to work, but like, if essential workers don't get to work, none of us have a job. We need to make sure that we're keeping our economy running. So I will say that's a promising change. Now the question is, how well do we continue to fund that after this crisis is over? Although the repercussions are going to last for a long time. And it's like, how much money can we pump from the federal government to cities, but also like, how are they managing it? Are they going to try to make transit free? Are they going to pay people to ride the bus? There's a lot of chatter in the chat about, what do we do to get people to use these other modes? And that's, you pay people. You pay people who have had to ride it for a long time, and retroactively, perhaps. We have a lot of these opportunities ready for us once the money starts flowing. So let's not make the same mistakes that we have in the past.
I'm going to ask the same question to Stefanie and Ashwini. Just not you. Alissa is a journalist, but from where in your realms, right? Are you seeing the conversation or language changing in a way that you think is particularly significant? Is government talking about outcomes and goals differently? Is the private sector thinking about public policy differently, or their approach in cities?
I'm gonna, yes, I think that in one example, I'll bring it back to the equity conversation. So I started researching equity 10 years ago or more than that. And similar to you, Benjie, at that time I had to couch it in sustainability to make it relatable to kind of a wider audience. But of course, like in recent years, equity has become more of a goal amongst many transportation agencies and cities and regions. And then more currently, the environment around racial and social justice and just it being more openly discussed has really put pressure on the industry to talk about the current disparities as well as the history of injustice and how transportation infrastructure has been used to both segregate and really destroy Black communities and other communities of color. And I'm really excited about work that we're doing at Toole that is really exploring our impact on perpetuating the legacy that the transportation industry has laid out, but also the power that we have to work to advance equity. And we're doing a number of equity analyses with clients that are helping us understand demographic patterns in different areas and how our plans can impact people of color, and as well as income-constrained households and people with disabilities and other often marginalized populations. But I think that equity being openly discussed and being a primary goal is helping become more clear on how we can advance equity, because there's an acknowledgement that there needs to be a shift in how we're planning and investing for also past injustices, and understanding that those are impacting what we're seeing today, and that there needs to be some acknowledgement and also rectification of that. And there's also more work on engaging communities that have been continually ignored and burdened by the transportation system, and not just engaging them, but listening and then acting on what we hear. And I think that that's becoming more understood, and that's really a deep change that we're seeing. And my hope is that these fundamental shifts then kind of move us past, setting up equity goals, but that we're then evaluating all of our goals through the frame of equity. So if we're saying we want to increase travel times on transit, we're not just looking at the average travel time across a city, but really understanding and improving service for those that have the longest travel trips, transit trips, and that variation between those that have the longest and the shortest, that we're focusing on that to make that less of a disparity.
I think I'm hearing a lot too about questioning the biases that are built into the system, which we already talked about, right? Like Scott Bernstein, who is on the board of Shared Use Mobility Summit, was talking to me about how the downtown commute became the measure for transportation systems at the exclusion of all others, apart from vehicle throughput, which is what the transportation system is built on. But it missed out completely on the inter-neighborhood travel. And so that kind of the awareness that there is things outside the data is important, and the awareness of, here's a secret, the governments will set goals and outcomes, but very often somewhere in between, we don't have a way to actually measure whether we're achieving those. So I think the awareness of that is shifting us in very good ways. Ashwini, you want to add something to?
Yeah, no, and I think equity is actually maybe the perfect lens to examine your question, which is, are cities becoming more outcome driven? Do they focus on the right KPIs? Are companies starting to build that into their thinking as well? And are they sharing some of those values and some of those same objectives? And equity is really a great prism to view that through, because the conversation there is a little fraught, right? I mean, you have cities that in theory, value equity, and part of the cost, the part of the price of admission for a company to operate in your city is, hey, you need to serve all of the city, not just the downtown, the tourist sort of CBD areas, or where kind of professionals are going to be using the service, but everywhere. Neighborhoods of color, poorer, wealthier neighborhoods, and so that's going to be that's the price of admission here. And so here's the form that takes, and it's often a blunt tool. You have to put X number of scooters in this neighborhood, and
Right.
city and companies will negotiate that number down, and cities will negotiate that number up. And at some point, the conversation kind of goes around enough times to where you really get to the gist of the underlying concern, which is, to be frank, in a lot of cities, this is something that cities have failed to accomplish themselves. They haven't achieved equity in the public services they provide. That may be transit lines that extend to all parts of the city. It may be bike lanes, protected bike lanes that exist in some parts of the city, but not in others. And so the conversation, I was in several conversations where it got to the point where there was a back and forth around, we can put scooters in the neighborhoods you tell us to, but are people going to ride them if there aren't safe places to ride? And like, that's not an argument for we shouldn't do this, but it is a yes, and you have to do that as well. And so I think there can be an alignment of interest, but there needs to be some degree of a level setting and an acknowledgement from both sides that actually neither of us has really prioritized this well historically, and how do we do that incrementally now, so that we're not sort of putting a public responsibility on a private player. You're then ticking a box, and really the only losers here are people who don't actually get service, because either you're begrudgingly providing vehicles, or we're begrudgingly building out bike lanes really slowly and in the wrong places.
I think that's a great frame for. We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to wrap up. I'd love to talk to you guys more, but I really like that. And one of the things we've talked about in Shared Use Mobility Center is, how do we move the conversation from how do we make shared use and public transportation more equitable, which results in exactly what you're saying, Ashwini, kind of this tactical, make sure it shows up on the south side or the west side or wherever the poor side of your city is, or where people of color live, and then count those numbers, right? Are there 50? Are there 100? And shift the conversation instead to, how does shared use mobility and transportation make our society more equitable, right? Which is now about delivering service so that families and households don't have to spend $12,500 a year having to own a car, or more than that, right? So that they can participate in opportunity in the economy and in community. And I think that's the kind of deep shift we're trying to look at. And with that, I'll plug also our distributed summit this year, which is happening in July. We're calling it the Big Shift. And we want to ask, how do we change the whole system? Everything from the physical infrastructure to the way money flows, to the way we think about our social networks and human infrastructure. And that's a conversation we want to have with you all. I'd like to thank my great panelists for this great conversation. Adonia, who can join with us, Ashwini, Stefanie, and Alissa for spending time with us. The 250 plus people who joined us online for this. Thank you very much. We're sorry we didn't get to your questions. We'll try to answer them online, but thank you for joining and spending time with us. And thank you for the rest of the team at the Shared Use Mobility Center. Have a good day. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Benjie.
Thank
Thanks, Stefanie,
you.
Alissa.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, bye.